Next week, we'll have two presentations by Des Cox and Brian McCarthy, and that will conclude this series. But for this week, we're very lucky to have two presenters who are both private planning consultants, and both are involved in phase 1 ORE projects. And today's presentations, they look at the role of the planning consultant in delivering offshore wind developments. Sybil Berne will present first, and she will give us an overview of the planning process for offshore wind, followed by Colm, who will give an insight into his experience to date of engaging with both on board Planola and with local planning authorities on offshore wind projects. Once again, each will make a presentation of 20-25 minutes, followed by a Q&A, and we'll finish at 2:15. And again, if you have any questions, please pop them into the chat box. We've very much appreciated the feedback you've given us on the sessions to date, and if you wouldn't mind doing so again, because as you know, we hope to continue this series next year. So we'll start off, and first up is Sybil Berne, who is an associate in McCabe, Berne, Derrens. She's worked there for 11 years. Sybil is qualified both in land use and in marine spatial planning. She first encountered MSP 10 years ago when she supported a project on the transposition of the Marine Directive in Ireland. Since then, she's worked on projects for the Marine Institute, the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, DEC, the EPA and the SCAI on MSP, offshore renewable energy and on environmental assessment. Sybil is a corporate member of the IPI and she is also a member of the MSP committee. Over to you, Sybil.
Thank you, Terry. I'm just going to share my screen if you can confirm everything is visible. I think you can see it now. And there we go. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Terry, for the introduction. As Terry said today, the presentation is in two parts. I'm just going to give an overview, and then Colm after me will give some more practical kind of insight into the process. So this is to give you a flavor of my presentation. First, it's just to recap very briefly on the legislative and policy background. Next, we get a quick look at what an offshore wind development team looks like. Then a very quick view again of the different project components, a very quick chat on the red line, design flexibility, and finally, what all planning consultant wants to know is what the application would look like. So first, obviously, we need to consider the legal framework because it really explains how we are doing things. So in the previous webinars, a number of these directives and bits of legislation have been discussed at with greater detail. So I'm not going to go too much into detail here, but I'm just going to focus on a few of them. First, we have to consider the Marine Strategy Framework Directive because obviously all the projects, as you would have guessed, are located in the marine area. So they have to consider the provisions of the directive. A bit perhaps more surprisingly, the provisions of the Water Framework Directive also have to be considered. The reason is obviously the arrays are located in the marine area, but at some point they do have to cross through coastal water to meet their onshore grid connection. Some of them may have interactions with the transitional water. So again, the provisions there will have to be considered. So that's just like I said, this has been covered in really brilliant ways over the last 7 weeks. So I don't want to spend too much time on the legal framework. I think here what's important to kind of consider is why we are doing this. So it won't come as a surprise to anybody attending this webinar, but obviously at the moment, offshore wind energy, offshore wind energy is all the talk. Everybody talks about offshore wind energy. And why is that? Well, Obviously, there is a very strong push at EU level and very positive support. First, we had the directive in 2018 on the promotion of use from renewable sources. The directive envisaged that at a pan-European level, we would have 32% of our power that would be sourced through renewable sources. Obviously, this implies that we have to consider offshore renewable energy in some shape or another. Then, I think about 2 weeks ago or so, this directive was amended by the RED number 3, which effectively increased the target to 40% by 2030, with another possible 2.5%. That directive has not been transposed yet. There's no indication when it will be transposed, but it's good to see that really there is great support for moving toward renewable energy. Then obviously we have to consider the EU strategy on offshore renewable energy 2020. So this strategy envisaged that we will have an installed capacity, not permitted, installed capacity of 60 gigawatt of offshore wind by 2030. And that target is to reach 300 gigawatt by 2050. So this is really quite a leap that we will be taking as a union. And everybody will have to contribute to a certain degree. It goes without saying that offshore wind energy and offshore renewable energy have to comply with environmental legislation, in particular with the directive. So the strategy kind of reiterated that. Now, last year, as everyone knows, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine broke out, and there was again another push at union level that for us we become more energy independent and more self-sufficient. To do that, the Commission published the Repower EU plan, which effectively superseded the initial target of 32% from the Renewable Energy Directive to a new target of 45%. Obviously, as you can see in the directive that was just enacted a few weeks ago, the RED 3, that target is actually a little bit lower, but you can see we still have a lot of work to do toward achieving that target. And again, Repower EU recognizes the role of offshore renewables. So as you can see, offshore renewables are going to happen. It's no longer an option, and Ireland is actually very well placed to deliver on some of the targets given it's an island nation. So that's just for the context. So what about the planners effectively? Well, our role in this kind of project is actually quite similar to our usual role in large-scale project. In general, we manage the planning process, and there is an emphasis on planning here, and you'll see why in the next slide. And that includes interacting with the stakeholders. The planner also advises on policy interpretation, and generally we're quite good at this because we do this every day. We advise our clients every day on how policy, what it can mean or what it should mean or how we should apply it. In some instances, this might depend on the team you're in, but it can input into the EIAR and into the planning documentation. So again, there's nothing kind of new here. We do the same job we have been doing before. What is different is the context we are doing it in. It's actually a lot more complex because of the nature of the team and the nature of the project. So do not take the position of any of these people as me inferring a degree of, a hierarchy, a degree of hierarchy or anything. But generally, really, the consent manager is really at the top of the hierarchy because this person oversees the entire consenting process, which goes beyond just the planning process. So this person has oversight of the entire process. That person then can work with the planning consultant, which really looks at the planning process. So as I said before, interacting with the planning authority, interacting with the board. So far, so good. That's only a couple of people. But then our team is actually a lot bigger and a lot more complex because we have other type of licensing or consenting people. There's offshore licensing manager, there are fisheries liaison officers, community liaisons officer, and then, of course, the EIR team. Those EIR teams are effectively 2 in 1. There is an EIR team for the onshore elements of the project and an EIR team for the offshore elements of the project. And in each of them, a specific specialized consultant. So these can be quite large. So really what the planning consultant is a form of a planning shepherd. We are guiding the process because that's what the planning process, because that's what we are used to do. It's actually very important because much of the project, of the success of the project will depend on whether it receives planning permission or not. All the projects that are in the phase 1 were given a maritime area consent. Therefore, they've been handpicked to proceed and all have a good chance, to be successful. So everybody is in with a chance. So the planning part is going to be critical as to whether the project gets a continuous forward or not. So obviously, to manage this process, we have to be mindful of the legal framework, but we also have to be mindful of the statutory time frame. For instance, we have to be mindful of the time of expiry of the maritime area consent. We also have to then, as I said previously, manage the interactions with the stakeholders, in particular then the board and the planning authorities. Now, I don't want to be stepping on Stephen Kay's toe because last week he gave an excellent presentation from the board's point of view. So really, I'm just going to keep that part high level, but really in kind of summary, you get your MAC, then you go and engage with onboard Planola through section 287. You may then as well, in parallel, it's optional, as Stephen said, engage in a 287A and B, which is the design flexibility. And at the same time, you will be engaging with the planning authority before you make an application under section 291. So I think first, what planners love, they love lines on drawings. They really like to know where everything is going to go. And this is the line of the project boundary. The maritime area consent for phase 1, as I said, these were delivered by the minister. The future MACs will be delivered by the Maritime Area Regulatory Authority. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail. Rory O'Leary gave an excellent presentation a few weeks ago, so I think he's covered everything. This red line is decided quite early on, which means it effectively, through the MAC, your marine red line has been determined. This is your project line. For the landfall and onshore element, landowners' consent is required, same to terrestrial planning. But again, because discussions have taken place early with AirGrid, effectively that's kind of determined very early on where the project's going to, where the landfall connection is going to be or where you're going to connect to the grid. So you have a good idea very early on what your project boundary is going to be. So really what the MAC covers is your array and your transmission cable, and then your landfall infrastructure is not covered in the MAC. And there is a twist, obviously, there can be design variations. So that's a little summary of what a project would look like. Apologies for my graphic design skills, they are quite limited, but you get the idea. We have an array that is connected via the transmission cable to the national grid onshore. So again, Stephen gave a very good presentation, not going into the detail, but first thing developers do, they go into consultation with onboard Planola under 287. But the next thing that's quite different from the projects that we're usually involved with is the part about design flexibility. So as Stephen said, that is actually an optional stage. It's not compulsory. The developers can opt in or out of going through the 287 process, the 287A and B process. But it's actually very useful because if you consider the span between the project design and the moment the project can be constructed, you can be looking at possibly 7 years or 9 years. which means in the meantime, between the moment you have designed your project and the moment the project is constructed, new, more efficient technology has come on stream, which you might want to avail of. So to make it easier for developers from the start, they can consider variation in design. So for an example, in year one, you might consider two different types of layout, two different types of array, one of which might include 90 turbines, and the other one might consider 75 turbines. And that could be down to the fact that you get bigger turbines, which have a much higher yield. But why is this important? Well, it's actually really important because it informs the preparation of the environmental impact statement, the environmental impact assessment report, and it informs, of course, the Natura impact statement. The idea is that, in effect, both assessments will have to consider the variation in designs because they could be built, which makes the process quite difficult because obviously there is a need for developer to have a degree of flexibility in what they can do, but there's also a need to provide certainty to the competent authority. So as the process is ongoing at the moment, Stephen mentioned last week, I think 4 of the 6 projects are going through this particular process at the moment. We don't actually have concrete examples to provide. So instead, I thought maybe to use a project in England that already went through the process and that was successful. This is the Hornsea Project 3 offshore wind farm. I apologize, maybe the quality of the picture is a little bit low, but as you can see, when they applied or Sted applied to the planning inspectorate for planning permission, they had an option with an array with 300 turbines, as you can see the little dots here, and another array with the dots a little bit spaced out for 160 turbines. And then they explain the differences between the variations between the two designs and assess them. By way of example, I've put a link straight to their EIAR. So that's for project flexibility. Now the application. Well, obviously we're in November 2023, and so far, no wind farm has gone through the process or actually made a full application yet under Section 291. But there are elements that we already know because either the board has told that would happen or the legislation actually said so. So for instance, we know that we'll have to consider the consistency with the National Marine Planning Framework. For those who are not familiar with the principle of the statement of consistency, it's a little bit like the ones that are prepared for strategic housing development, but obviously tailored to this specific project. Our EIARs will be effectively 2 in 1. There will be onshore EIAR and offshore EIAR in one. Again, I don't have really kind of examples that are current, but I can recommend that you look at the Celtic Interconnector, which effectively was in 2 parts and is Irish. So at least this is kind of relevant to Ireland. And also you can look at the 17 wind farms that have gone through the process in the planning inspectorate in England, so you can familiarize yourself. There are new topics that perhaps we are not as familiar with, such as commercial fisheries, navigational risk, etc., which will need to be considered in the EIAR. Obviously, this also means a raft of surveys and technical appendices that will need to be provided as well. One thing that the EIARs will do is that they will have to take into account the ecosystem services, which is quite different from the approach on land at the moment. And then obviously, we'll have to provide project websites, public notices, because the public needs to be able to be informed, have easy access to the application so that they can participate in the process should they wish to. And finally, where that's relevant, maybe some projects will be, there will be notification of the transboundary authorities. So that's what we know so far. Unfortunately, I know this sounds a little bit theoretical, but as I said, no project has been submitted to the board yet as by under section 291. So therefore you'll have to wait until next year to get a bit more details. And so to conclude, before I pass the baton onto Colm, I just wanted to give a quick recap. Really, the planning consultant operates in a much larger team than usual, and we have new collaborators and new colleagues that we don't necessarily have usually. We have to bear in mind that the projects are quite different from what we are used to. They include both marine and terrestrial elements. They include three kind of groups, large groups, put it this way, the radio transmission and the onshore grid connection, and that there can be design flexibility for certain aspects of the project. So that's it for me, and I hope you found this interesting, and now I will pass it on to Colm.
Thank you very much, Sybil. That was fantastic, and you certainly gave us an insight into the complexities involved, not least, you know, the onshore and offshore EIR, just to start with. And I think you've invented a new planning term, the planning shepherd. Very telling. And Colm will be telling us about his own shepherding of developments as well. But I'll just introduce you to Colm. Actually, Colm is a director of MKO, where he has responsibility for planning and project communications. He joined MKO in 2017 and has over 18 years experience as a planner. Prior to joining MKO, Colm worked as a planner with a large-scale renewable energy developer based in London. His particular areas of focus are SID and marine spatial planning. He's a corporate member of the IPI and also a member of the MSP committee. So, Colm.
Thank you, Terry. You can all hear me okay, and good afternoon to you all. If you can just bear with me for one moment and I will share my screen. No doubt, Terry, you will let me know that it's visible.
All good, Colm. You just have the side panels open. Yeah, perfect. Perfect.
Thanks, Terry. Good afternoon to you all. Colm Ryan's my name, from MKO Planning and Environmental Consultants, and thank you, Sybil, for another very engaging presentation as part of this whole CPD event. And I'd just like to give credit to the IPI for putting forward this very welcome and topical CPD seminar. So folks, I guess in terms of what I'm going to speak to you about over the next 20 minutes or so is to look at the role of the planner and try and focus more around the practical elements of our role in these projects, try and focus around maybe an insight into the day-to-day role of the planner on offshore wind projects. And in terms of the overview of the presentation, I'll give a brief introduction about MKO. I'll look at the role of the planner in terms of the offshore wind projects, touch on the whole pre-planning space as part of these projects, maybe give you some insights to our own experiences to date, touch briefly on the policy support side of matters. I've also included a couple of slides with regards to a flavour of the site surveys that will form part of these applications as they come forward for the offshore wind projects. I'm going to spend a minute or two around landscape and visual, and towards the end of my presentation then I'm going to touch on certainly a very important element of these projects, and it's the community engagement piece. And final slide then just touches very briefly on the construction and operational phase. So in terms of MKO then, the organization that I work for, we're planning and environmental consultancy based in Galway, with offices also in Dublin now. We have over 200 experienced professionals across a number of areas, including planning, environmental, ecology, ornithology, project management, land solutions, project comms, and GIS. And we have a considerable base of experience in the renewable space, and we're certainly like I guess many of you on the call, looking forward to getting more involved in these offshore wind projects. Whilst as a country we're pretty familiar with the onshore element of this, we now need to start getting our heads around pretty quickly the offshore element of delivery of these projects. I thought it might be interesting, and even chatting to Sybil and indeed to Terry prior in preparation for today's presentation, we are mindful of the great scope and the different backgrounds that are tuning into the CPD. So we've done our best to try and keep it at a level that will be of interest to as many as possible, be that whatever level of experience you might have in terms of planning, be that a recent graduate or indeed been in the game for quite some time. We thought we hopefully we have hit an appropriate point there in terms of experience. How does it all start then with regards to these offshore wind projects, and when that inquiry comes into the office, what are the most immediate steps on the back of these inquiries? Well, one major part in terms of the lead planner is to mobilize key members of the team. And I know Sybil has touched on some of those members of the team, but from an initial perspective on the back of that inquiry, certainly there is a number of core team members that you would go to and that you would get on board in terms of initial discussion. And that's certainly around the engineering services of these projects, the planning and environmental services of these projects. And of course, it's not just the onshore environmental services that are relevant to these offshore wind, it's the offshore environmental services and your landscape and visual. Certainly, it's probably a recommendation to engage with those core people on the back of an early inquiry and host a meeting with these key contributors to a project going forward. And it's certainly what we've seen to be of benefit is to have that initial discussion with these key team members. To give you an insight then of what items might be discussed at these early stages of these projects, obviously there's high-level discussions around location, be that a proposed location or a confirmed location. There's discussions around the status of the foreshore lease. There's discussions around your maritime area consent and ensuring that that is in place. And also, I guess if you're to start thinking about the project then itself and what will be the main elements of that project, there will be an indicative number of turbines involved, and indicative details with regards to the offshore substation, an indicative location of the inter-array cables, the export cables, the landfall infrastructure, and indeed the onshore substation and the compound, and what that may comprise of as you move forward into considering engagement early with the decision makers as part of the pre-planning process. And I think it's out of those initial discussions that you start to consider a scope of services as your role in these projects. And you work very closely, as Sybil identified in her very informative slide there, that you work very closely with the environmental coordinator in order to prepare an appropriate and detailed scope of services to work on these projects. In terms of what might be involved in the scope, what might be involved in the requirements of a future application, or indeed in terms of a submission to be considered to work on these projects, you may have a high-level project brief. Obviously, you would be including your relevant experience and a proposed project team, be that internal and indeed external. And it's probably fair to say that a lot of these projects will be supported by external expertise. Some expertise may be from locations like Scotland, for example, who have considerable experience in delivering of offshore wind projects, the environmental assessment services, both onshore and offshore, the planning services, the consultation and stakeholder engagement, and also that whole project management piece. I'd like to spend maybe a minute or two then around the planning services and what they might comprise of. And in order to, I guess, try and simplify this, I've decided to split it up into looking at the pre-planning services and then the planning application content itself, and what our role as planners in these projects may comprise of. Under the title of the pre-planning services, you as the planner are engaging with on board Planola in terms of pre-planning consultations. You're engaging with the relevant local authorities in the form of those pre-application consultations, and you're constantly reviewing the relevant planning policy context. I'm sure all of you will agree on the CPD event this afternoon that, you know, we're in a very changeable environment when it comes to planning policy, and it is a significant role for us as planners to keep on top of that ever evolving policy context, but also indeed the legislation, and that's never more relevant as on back of this week's publication of the planning bill. We also get involved in devising a planning strategy, and that planning strategy can be I think fluid is an appropriate way of describing what a planning strategy may comprise of, that you're looking at what ways to steer a project through the legislation, to steer a project through the relevant policy context. And we certainly see our role in devising those appropriate strategies on these offshore wind projects. Then, and as Sybil identified there, obviously a planning application hasn't gone through the process yet, but given it some thought as to what it might comprise of into the future, you would certainly be considering the consultation meetings with the relevant local authorities. You'd be considering the consultation with statutory authorities and relevant third-party stakeholders, and certainly considering the preparation of public notices, the application forms, and indeed the planning application reports and supporting statements, which are key to the role of the planner in these offshore wind projects. Touching then on the pre-planning engagement, and again, the role of the planner in this, we certainly see the planning consultant acting as the main primary contact, be that with the board or indeed the local authority in the form of pre-planning engagement. And that includes the preparation of the initial submission or briefing documents that may be associated or of use or indeed of benefit to the wider project team and indeed the board or the local authority. There's also a significant role in the preparation of maps and documentations for presentations at these pre-planning meetings, and of course attending with the other key representatives that I mentioned earlier, be that at meetings with on board Planola or indeed any particular local authority that may be involved. And whilst a lot of work goes into, as I'm sure many of you are aware, into preparation for those meetings, the all-important debrief thereafter in terms of discussion with the applicant and the team is as important as the detail that goes into the presentation initially. Given some thought to what might be included in those pre-planning engagement meetings with the board or with the local authority, certainly the content would include a lot of the following: some project background, some high-level descriptions, the policy overview, the legislative overview, some details around the site location and selection, the alternatives could possibly be discussed at these early pre-planning engagements, the proposed development itself, the grid connection route, and the site surveys and investigations. I'm just going to give you a flavour of that as well in a slide ahead. The constraints assessment, the design process, and some key project elements all form a significant element of your presentations to the decision makers. Landscape and visual amenity, as you can appreciate, are of significant focus in these discussions, and they are also supported in terms of the relevant photo montages. Construction and operational overview, it's probably fair to say that majority of us are fairly new to what the construction and operational phase, whilst we have experience of onshore projects, the construction and operation of offshore wind is certainly a different approach, and lots of learnings there, but of significant interest to all concerned, and certainly some details are provided at on construction operation at the pre-app stage. These are just some slides on the policy overview side of matters. One that we have found very useful is to identify a policy timeline, which covers all of the relevant policy matters that Sybil would have touched on previously. And it's useful, I think, to identify where a particular project might be located within these policy timelines, and form a good basis of the development and where you're presenting that to the board or to the local authority. It just gives a useful overview in our view of where things are at from a policy perspective. The European policy context is also crucial, and Sybil already touched on in terms of the targets that we as a nation have to meet, and we certainly find ourselves in the industry making constant reference to these requirements, and it's almost important that we don't lose sight of these requirements in terms of delivery on renewable energy strategies and those targets involved. The national policy context, obviously, that you would have heard on a good few occasions now over the course of the CPD event, but these are obviously to the core in terms of the pre-planning engagement strategies and the planning strategies that will form the basis of these projects going forward. Just touching on briefly then in terms of the site surveys and investigations and what may be required as part of these offshore wind projects. I've devised two slides here looking at what surveys may be required from an onshore perspective, but also the surveys from an offshore side of things. And onshore, looking at onshore first, there's noise surveys, geotechnical surveys, terrestrial walkovers and site-specific mammal surveys, the bat surveys, hydrological surveys, including surveys of watercourse crossings if required, topographical surveys, archaeological walkover surveys, and landscape and visual impact assessment, and also the transport assessment form the basis of some of the content of these projects. From an offshore side of things, the maritime traffic surveys, geophysical surveys, bird and marine mammal surveys, also offshore bat surveys, geotechnical, and the benthic habitat surveys. So many of you will be familiar with the volume of survey and the detail that is required for onshore wind projects. That is certainly absolutely the case for offshore, and in many respects even more requirements around marine ecology in particular. From landscape and visual amenity perspective, there's a lot of discussion that goes around in terms of the team itself to confirm the radius study area, to identify the number of viewpoints, working closely indeed with the local authority involved to confirm the quantum and the appropriate nature of these viewpoints. The selected viewpoints are then to represent a range of both coastal and inland receptors, including any relevant scenic designations and settlements that may be relevant to the project. Out of these high-level studies, then there is a series of verified views and associated photo montages, and these photo montages are not only used in terms of the content of the planning application, but it's also very important in terms of that community engagement piece and I guess getting the detail out there of what the project may comprise of. The environmental impact assessment is obviously a crucial factor of these application content, and certainly the chapters within these environmental impact assessment reports with sections specifically associated with offshore and sections specifically associated with onshore. In terms of the community consultation piece, I thought it would be merited a brief touching on it here in the context of its importance, and many of you will be aware of the importance of community engagement on projects, whatever scale or size they might be, but certainly it's the view that the offshore projects do need to be supported by meaningful engagement with the local community. There may be recommendations to have community liaison officers, the website live to update the general public, meetings with number of community organizations and stakeholders, information articles, engagement with local businesses, engagement with the local press, I guess, just to keep individuals and locals in the local community updated on the content of these applications prior to the submission of them, to make sure that people are as informed as they possibly can be, and they know what the project content will be about. The Community Benefit Fund is an interesting one. We might touch a bit about that later. And also the opportunities around careers, training and skills and information event, and including a virtual exhibition, all feeding into this meaningful efforts around community consultation and stakeholder engagement for these large-scale projects. My last slide touches on the construction element, which really you could host an entire CPD event around the construction side of it. I myself find it quite interesting, and what are the areas that are discussed within a team on the construction of these offshore wind projects. You're considering how long will it take to construct the offshore elements. There's discussions around what port is being considered for the turbines during the construction. How long will it take to construct the onshore elements of these projects? Will there be a requirement for an operations and maintenance facilities to support the operational phase of these offshore wind projects? Discussions around the identity of any construction activities that will be required within any third-party lands or the third or public road network. What type of vessels will be used during the offshore construction phase, and also the details around what particular foundation concept that may arise as part of these projects. All cutting edge in terms of the technology involved, all very, very interesting, and something I guess that we as an industry and indeed as a country are looking forward to finding out even more about these projects as we get into the phase of preparation for the application content. So that concludes all of my slides. I'd like to thank you for your attention of it, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you on it. Thank you.
Colm, thank you very much for a very helpful and very informative presentation. And you certainly, again, like Sybil, laid out the challenges involved in a changing policy environment as well. We have a number of questions